very much. It's great to be here. Can everybody hear me in the back? Is this a good volume? We're going to start off with a prayer. We're going to start off with a prayer from the Reverend Holly Ingalls. If she would just come up and do that. Sure, use that mic.
We on? No. Can you hear me? Okay. Let us begin this evening by opening ourselves to what we will see, opening ourselves to what we will hear, and opening ourselves to what we will feel. Please join me. Divine Creator, in your great wisdom, you've created all people in your image, without exception. Open our eyes to see the dignity, beauty, and worth of every human being. Open our minds to understand that all your children are sisters and brothers in the same human family. Open our hearts to repent of racist attitudes, behaviors, and speech which demean others. Open our ears to hear the cries of those wounded by racial discrimination and their passionate appeals for change. Strengthen our resolve to make amends for past injustices and to right the wrongs of history. And fill us with courage that we might seek to heal wounds, build bridges, forgive and be forgiven, and establish peace and equality for all people in our community and around the world. May it be so. Amen.
All right, I'm going to tell you a story tonight. It's a true story. It's a story about Jacksonville, St. Augustine, and the First Coast. And I'm going to say right away, parts of this story are a bit uncomfortable, and there's really no way for them not to be. This is a story that needs to be told because it's one of the greatest moments in Jacksonville history. In the summer of 1964, over a 6-month period, some of the most iconic figures of the second half of the 20th century converge on the First Coast and engage in some of the most iconic events. It's also a story about ordinary people caught up in extraordinary times. But mostly it's a story about how Jacksonville, St. Augustine, and the First Coast changed America and the entire world in a 6-month period in the summer of 1964. To set the scene, I want to go back to 1963, September of 1963, a federal judge in downtown Jacksonville by the name of Brian Simpson issued an order desegregating the schools. This caused a lot of turmoil. The very first students to integrate the schools were elementary kids. In Duval County, one of those children had their house firebombed. In St. Johns County, in St. Augustine, the family of the first child to integrate an elementary school went to their very first PTA meeting. How many people here have been to a PTA meeting? They walked out to find their car was on fire. Racial tensions were heightening. In November of 1963, they attempted to integrate the lunch counter at the Woolworths in St. Augustine on King Street. The doors to that Woolworth are still there today. Has anybody ever seen them? One of them goes to an art gallery and one of them goes to a bank. They're still there. When I took my son said, Martin Luther King touched these doors. And indeed he did. Those children were sent to reform school. for 9 months for attempting to order coffee at the Woolworths. Reform schools in Florida were particularly awful places to be. They were given a choice. Their parents could sign a document that said that they would never protest again, or they could go to reform school. They chose to go to reform school. They would eventually be released by Judge Brian Simpson. Judge Brian Simpson has a building named after him downtown. It's the courthouse. The federal courthouse that sits where the Woolworths used to be on Hemming Park is the Brian Simpson Judicial Center. As 1964 begins, St. Augustine is getting ready to celebrate its 400th anniversary. And there's tension over the 400th anniversary because there's a bunch of federal money going to be spent in St. Augustine. That's summer of 1965. And the committee to determine how to spend that money is all white. This leads a man named Robert Haling, an African-American dentist, the first African-American dentist in the state of Florida, and chairman of the NAACP in St. Augustine, to begin to protest. And they begin to march in St. Augustine. The city responds by increasing the police presence. Violence erupts regularly. Klansmen drive through Lincolnville with CB radios and shotguns and Confederate flags on their antenna, trying to keep the protests from, or trying to stop the protests. There's a man named Richard Holstead Manussi, Hoss Manussi. He's the president of a group called the Ancient City Hunting Club, sometimes referred to as the Ancient City Gun Club. He's the leader of the segregationists. He has his guys running around the town trying to keep everybody from protesting. They sometimes refer to these guys as Manussi's Raiders. They begin to win this battle of stopping the integrationists or the desegregationists from protesting. Haling sends out a letter, and he puts it in the papers in the North. And what he asks is that students from the Northeast come down to St. Augustine for spring break, not to enjoy the sun, but to protest segregation. One of the first people to answer that call was the most unlikely person. Her name was Mary Parkman Peabody. She's 72 years old. She's the mother of the governor of the state of Massachusetts. Her husband is an Episcopal bishop, retired, the state of New York. And her father-in-law is Endicott Peabody, who taught FDR at the Groton School. FDR mentions him in his fourth and final inaugural address. He says, "My schoolmaster, Dr. Peabody, taught me that civilization always advances." Peabody shows up. She's a very unusual snowbird. She comes to St. Augustine to get arrested. It takes very little time for that to happen. She and Haling and some other community leaders attempt to go to lunch. Sheriff L.O. Davis, who was the sheriff of St. Johns County at that time, comes and arrests her. She spends 3 days in the St. Augustine jail. She refuses to make bond. The story runs nationally. They put her in a segregated jail cell. She reports that there are 50 black women in the cell next door, and she's all alone with her friend. At the end of 3 days, they release her. She flies home, but national attention is now focused on St. Augustine. The protests and the violence escalate. Martin Luther King sends Andrew Young down here to try and get things calm. Andrew Young gets here, he decides he's not going to calm things down, he's going to lead a march. And he attempts to lead a march across King Street from Lincolnville into what we now call Plaza de la Constitución. But in 1964, that plaza had a different name. It was called Slave Market Square. As Andrew Young attempts to cross the street, he's viciously beaten. Several days later, Martin Luther King arrives. At that time, the Beatles hold the top 5 songs in America on the Billboard charts, 1 through 5. Also at that time, Sports Illustrated runs a column entitled, "How Fast is Hayes?" Now the Hayes they're talking about is a 20-year-old kid from Jacksonville named Robert Lee Hayes. You all know him better as Bullet Bob. He's going to run in the Olympics that summer. And the question that Sports Illustrated asks is, he really as fast as he seems? He's a football player from Florida A&M. In the article, they talk about him, and they talk about him racing kids for a nickel, growing up in Jacksonville. His childhood friends refer to Bob Hayes as the shortest distance between 2 points. Hayes has been blistering tracks all over the black college track meets. But we wonder, is he as fast as he seems? His football coach at Florida A&M thinks he knows the answer. He says, Bob Hayes is the fastest man who ever lived. Meanwhile, in St. Augustine, these riots and protests are gaining momentum. People come from all around. Martin Luther King brings in marchers from Montgomery. The Klan brings in people from Palatka and Jacksonville. The governor, Ferris Bryant, sends 400 state troopers to keep the peace. And every single night, the integrationists, mostly black, march around Plaza de la Constitución, or Slave Market Square. Inside the slave market, Hoss Manuzzi, a KKK attorney named J.B. Stoner, and an itinerant preacher named Connie Lynch hold segregationist meetings. In between, 400 state troopers try and keep the groups apart. Violence erupts almost every single night. Connie Lynch preaches to anybody who will listen about segregation. In the daylight hours, the protests move to the beaches. And groups of integrationists march down to the beach in St. Augustine and go into the water, the White Beach. The very first day, they're met by an angry mob, they're beaten. Every day after that, the state troopers form a cordon and march the protesters out into the ocean about knee-deep in the water, and then march them back, while angry segregationists dance around the outside, screaming obscenities. One of the quotes in a New York Times article from that time quotes a St. Augustine woman as saying, "I don't know why they want to swim at that beach. They have a perfectly good colored beach right down the road." And some people will tell you Butler Beach is the best beach around here, right? So, in this case, maybe she was right. Oh, there they are. You guys uncomfortable yet? A little uncomfortable with this? A little? This is the greatest story. And look, what my goal here tonight is not to tell you an embarrassing story. I want you to embrace this story. Because what's about to happen is going to change the world. It's going to change the United States. It's going to change the way we deal with each other. St. Augustine that summer becomes the epicenter of the civil rights movement. And that movement is concentrated on one particular location in St. Augustine, the Monson Motor Inn or Monson Motor Lodge, owned by James Brock. On June 11th, Martin Luther King goes and he attempts to go into that restaurant to eat. He's obviously denied service. He and the owner, Jimmy Brock, have a debate on the steps. Brock points out that he's had to arrest 84 people since Easter Sunday. King attempts to enter. He's arrested. He spends the time in the St. Augustine jail. 1 week later, a group of protesters show up at the mosque, including 17 rabbis. They attempt to pray outside the Monson Motor Lodge. They are all arrested. As the police are dragging these guys off to the police cars to take them to jail, a group of kids jump into the pool at the Monson Motor Lodge. Kidney-shaped pool. LBJ is running for president that summer, and he's running against a guy from Arizona named Barry Goldwater. He's been pushing to have the Civil Rights Act passed all year long. And the Civil Rights Act will open restaurants and motels to everyone, regardless of race, creed, or color. But he can't, because Barry Goldwater and a group of Southern senators are filibustering the Civil Rights Act. They're stopping it from coming to a vote. That day, when those kids jump in the pool, and by the way, the pool is still there, outside the Hilton Gardens, very same pool. When those kids jump into the pool, Jimmy Brock has had it. He's beyond, at this point, they've been protesting his restaurant for weeks. He's had it. He loses his mind. He grabs 2 bottles of muriatic acid and he rushes around the pool, emptying the acid. You guys seen that picture? It's this one. No, it's this one.
Yeah, right.
It's this one. And he's emptying that muriatic acid and the kids are screaming in horror. Okay? This is either the most embarrassing moment in our history or the greatest. Because that picture runs worldwide. Everybody sees that picture. It's the most iconic picture to come out of the Civil Rights Movement, and it happened right here on the First Coast. And the very next day, LBJ ends the filibuster in the Senate, and the Civil Rights Act is passed. June 19, 1964, one day after Brock empties that acid into the pool. The very next day, they say Jimmy Brock put an alligator in that pool. Make sure it didn't happen again. Brock has been vilified. And he has his apologists as well. But I think it's worth remembering he was just an ordinary guy. He was probably not all that much different than the hotel owner down the street. It just happened that all this stuff happened at his hotel. So the Civil Rights Act passes. Martin Luther King and goes to the White House. They sign the Civil Rights Act on July 2nd, 1964. All because of what happened here. Also that summer, the Beatles are touring the United States. They're going to play a little over 30 concerts in a little over 30 days. One of those concerts is going to be here in Jacksonville at the Gator Bowl. The problem is that by contract and by city ordinance, the Gator Bowl is segregated. The Beatles don't like that. John Lennon says they've never played segregated audiences and they're not about to start now. He would sooner give up his appearance. There's back and forth throughout the month of August as to whether the Beatles will come here or not. The concert itself is sponsored by WAPE, Anybody remember listening to WAPE when you were younger? WAPE had a 50,000 watt water-cooled transmitter that was designed to sound loud. And you could hear it as far away as Charleston and Cape Canaveral. In fact, in their ads on the billboards, on the drive down from the north, they advertised that they offered 500 miles of music. And the reason the Beatles had agreed to come here, the reason we were able to get the Beatles at all, was because of WAPE. Because they had enough distance to draw people in to come to the Beatles concert. But it's unclear whether the Beatles are going to come because they don't want to pay at the Gator Bowl. On September 5th, they issue a statement. They say, unless whites and Negroes are allowed to sit together, we will not come. The city relents, and they allow the Beatles to perform. Or they allow the Gator Bowl to be integrated. So on September 11th, the first integrated event in Gator Bowl history is set to occur. The young people are thrilled. The old people, somewhat less so. The Times Union's kind of upset about it. They announced that the Beatles are just a passing fad. Wow, sorry. Look at all those police cars in St. Augustine. In their report on the concert, they'll end up saying that the Beatles, all four Beatles sing after a fashion. So the concert's stayed, the Beatles are coming, everybody's excited. There's going to be another problem. Hurricane Dora. The Beatles are set to play September 11th. On September 10th, Hurricane Dora makes landfall in Milano, shortly after midnight. Thousands of people are without power. We've got a power guy here who worked the power lines in 1964. Hundreds are homeless. Dozens are dead. The hurricane rips up the beachfront down here, takes out the seawall. Houses topple over onto the beach. Broken houses. The boardwalk, the piers are destroyed. Jacksonville streets are littered with fallen trees. The hurricane does tremendous amounts of damage. That next morning, President Johnson, LBJ, arrives in Jacksonville to survey the damage. He lands at Naval Station, Naval Air Station, yeah. And his motorcade goes racing to the beaches about 80 miles an hour. They get here, and LBJ has his picture taken all up and down the beach, standing on broken piles of concrete. And there's a famous picture of him holding the hand of a little girl. And her name is Mary Ann Jokum. And Mary Ann's father was a football coach at Fletcher and a teacher. Taught, what did he teach? Math. A math teacher. Okay, good. And he was also a city councilman, which is how he got there. LBJ was the consummate politician. He saw a pretty little girl, a pretty little blonde-haired girl. He went over and got his picture taken. They talked for a minute or two. LBJ told the little girl about his daughters back home, and he gave her a pen from the White House. She's now, well, she thinks she's retired now, but she was an attorney in Albuquerque. LBJ, having had his photo op, having walked around with Governor Ferris Bryant and other local politicians, he goes back to NAS Jax. He takes off. A couple of hours later, the Beatles land. They go to the George Washington Hotel, where they hold a press conference. That press conference is pretty interesting. You can see it online. A woman, television reporter from Tampa, comes and asks each of them whether or not they're married. She seems to have an interest in each of them and suggests that maybe they should come to Tampa and see her sometime. The Beatles are eating in the lobby. They don't check into the hotel. They don't check into the hotel because there is no room in the hotel for the African American opening acts. The George Washington Hotel doesn't have rooms for them. There were a couple of opening acts that come with the Beatles in '64. Jackie DeShannon. People remember Jackie DeShannon?
Yep.
What's that song she sings?
Little Love in Your Heart.
Little Love in Your Heart. Thank you so much. That's a good one. Little Love in Your Heart. One of the other opening acts is the Exciters. And they're an African American music group. They sing a song called Tell 'em. People know Tell 'em? Tell 'em, tell 'em, tell 'em that you love him. Tell 'em that you need him. Tell 'em, tell 'em, tell 'em, tell 'em right now. Anyway, there's no room, so they don't check into the Washington Hotel. They do go to the Gator Bowl, and they go in a 1964 Ford Fairlane. There's a picture of it that shows up every once in a while if you're wondering why that picture's there. The 4 Beatles are in the back of that car. Can you imagine? And they drive to the Gator Bowl. They play 12 songs in about 35 minutes. The winds are howling so badly from Hurricane Dora that they have to nail Ringo Starr's drum kit to the stage to keep it from blowing away. I've talked, anybody go to the concert? How many people? I know I talked to a couple people beforehand. Tell me if I'm right, tell me if this is your recollection, but most of the people that I've spoken to who actually were at that concert say that between the howling of the winds and the screaming of the girls, that you could barely hear anything. Is that your recollection? As far as I know, there's one 5-second clip of that show. It was taken by a radio station out of Detroit that actually flew people down for the concert. 23,000 people went. The tickets were $4 and $5. It was $5 to sit on the ground. It was $4 to sit in the stadium. More tickets were sold, but because of the storm, only 23,000 people showed up. They played most of the music through the public address. Same system they used to announce, first and 10. Touchdown, Florida, right? While they're there at the Washington Hotel, a local reporter by the name of Billy Broussard, who's 19 years old at the time, and because of all the events going on in Jacksonville over this 24-hour period, they got reporters covering the storm, they got reporters covering LBJ, so they sent this 19-year-old girl to cover the Beatles. She ends up on an elevator with them in the George Washington Hotel. She's so embarrassed that she gets off. But apparently she was pretty. She wrote, you can read her story too. And Paul McCartney may or may not have taken a fancy to her. At least she thought Paul McCartney liked her. So when they leave, the manager grabs Billy Broussard and puts her into the car. They drive to the airport together. They almost get into a car accident because all the stoplights are out. They get on the plane, they stick her on the plane, and she flies with them to Toronto. Dream come true, right? In her column or article, she writes about the event. One of the things she mentions is that she saw both Paul McCartney and George Harrison in their underwear.
Wow.
She comes back, she writes an article. It's a decent little article. For the rest of her, oh, by the way, she didn't like the Beatles. She was not a Beatles fan. But for the rest of her life, everybody, she says, always wanted to hear that story. And I bet they did. I want to hear that story too. So the Beatles leave. There's one other event besides the presidential election in the summer of 1964, and that's the Summer Olympics. And the Summer Olympics that year are in Tokyo. And because they're in Tokyo, something about Tokyo weather, they don't hold the Olympics until October. Bob Hayes is playing football for Florida A&M, and his coach, Jack Gaithers, wants him to keep playing football. LBJ calls Jack Gaithers and says, I want Bob Hayes practicing for the 100-meter dash. Jack Gaithers says, yes, sir, Mr. President. And they get Hayes practicing. So in October, can we find it? In October of 1964, 20-year-old Robert Lee Hayes from Jacksonville runs the 100-meter dash in Tokyo. And if you just bear with me, I want to actually have this up. There he is. Big guy, isn't he? You got it?
Yeah, that's my boss.
Oh, go. Run. Let's go into... Okay, here we go. I love this beginning part where he's in his sunglasses hammering in his starting blocks. He looks pretty cool, doesn't he? He's thinking, feet, fail me not. This may be the only opportunity I got. He's 6'1", 190-pound fullback from Florida A&M, Matthew W. Gilbert High School. He's running, he's bow-legged. He's running in borrowed shoes. He's running in the inside lane. They'd run one of those walking races the day before, and the track's all chewed up. Look at him go. He's about to win the 100-meter dash by the largest margin of victory ever. No one before or since has run away from a field by that much. 7 feet. He's going to run the time 10 flat. He's going to be the first person to ever run a 10 flat 100 meter. He's poetry in motion. But he's not done. Several days later, he runs in the 4x100 meter relay. And before the relay begins, the leadoff runner for the French team goes up to the leadoff runner for our team, and he says, "You can't win. All you have is Hayes." To which the American responded, "That's all we need, baby." The American team, relay team, had trouble with their baton passes in that event. When it gets to the final leg, the anchor leg, Hayes' leg, the Americans are 7 yards behind the leaders, the French, in 5th place. Hayes takes the baton. 30 meters into his leg, he runs past everyone. It's considered to this day to be the fastest leg of a 4x100 meter race ever run. 8.3 seconds. God is right, it's all we needed. The same day that he wins the 100 meters, Martin Luther King learns that he's been awarded the Nobel Prize. Virgil Stewart, the police chief in St. Augustine, says that he considers that Nobel Prize, that Nobel Peace Prize, to be the greatest joke of the year. How can you give him the Nobel Peace Prize after all the trouble he stirred up down here? In November, Hayes comes back to Jacksonville. They throw a parade in his honor. The participants in that parade include Florida A&M, Texas A&M, Matthew W. Gilbert High School, and other predominantly African-American institutions. couple hours before the parade, somebody goes into the Times Union with a note. The note says, there's going to be a parade in downtown Jacksonville for Bob Hayes today. The editor looks at it and says, well, we're not going to cover that. And here's one of the heroes of this story. A woman named Jessie Lynn Kerr. People know Jessie Lynn? Jessie Lynn Kerr is insistent. She says, I want to take a photographer and cover that parade. There are no other two-time Olympic gold medalists coming home to Jacksonville today. I don't care if he's black, white, brown, yellow, or purple with pink polka dots. I want to go. And the editor relented and gave her a photographer and sent her out to cover the Bob Hayes parade. That picture on the front page of the Times Union is the first time that an African American is featured in that paper who was not under arrest. I love this story. And I love it partially because it's a story about turmoil and difficult times. But it's a story about overcoming. This is not a story about our darkest moment. This is a story about our brightest moments, where we overcame segregation, racial hatred, and created a better world. Not just for Jacksonville and St. Augustine, but for the entire United States. And perhaps even the entire world. If you look at the time now and what's going on, there's a lot of hatred. We fight over politics, race, creed. Is that true? And I see that in my mind, that what we're going through right now is a lot like what we went through in the 1920s and again in the 1960s. You have a youth culture pushing for change. You have an establishment not ready for youth culture, youth music, youth YouTube. YouTube. That's my son. He likes YouTube. But we overcome that. And that's the message I want to leave you with. That we can overcome this period of time like we overcame the issues in the 20s and again in the 60s. Now, the future is bright. Who am I to tell you to believe in this bright future? I mean, I'm just an amateur historian, right? Oh, but I can tell you, the future, I can point the way towards this better future. I've seen historically where we go through these times and we always come out stronger because we're Americans and that's what we do. Thank you for listening to me. Thank you for coming here tonight. Thank you for putting up with the crowds. I hope you liked this speech as much as I like giving it.